Alright, so we've talked about the electron geometry, and basically what it boils down to is how many groups are around the central atom after you've drawn the proper Lewis structure. And so we came up with the basic 5 shapes. And I encourage you to look at lots of pictures of these or look at models of these. We have models in the lab, we have models in the lecture room. And so essentially, depending on how many groups there are around the central atom, remember that a group is a lone pair, a group is a single bond, a group is a double bond, and a group can be a triple bond. This will describe that electron geometry, the shape of the electron groups around the central atom. The molecular geometry, or molecular shape, can be a little more complicated. And it is a little more complicated if lone pairs are involved, if there are lone pairs on the molecule. For example, if there are 2 groups around the central atom, there's my central atom, and I have 2 groups, which means those groups are going opposite of each other in a linear arrangement. If both of those groups have atoms attached, I still call the molecular geometry or the molecular shape linear because the 3 atoms form a line. If there are 3 groups around a central atom, those 3 groups will take on a trigonal planar arrangement where the bond angle is about 120 degrees. If there are 3 atoms attached to each one of those groups, an atom attached to each group, I still call the molecular geometry or the molecular shape trigonal planar. And I do so because the shape that the atoms make is a trigonal planar arrangement with a bond angle of about 120. However, if there is a lone pair among those 3 groups, the 3 groups will still take on an electron geometry of trigonal planar, but if only 2 of those groups have atoms attached and the 3rd group is a lone pair of electrons, that lone pair takes up space. So here I've drawn it in the up position. There is a region of space occupied by that lone pair, but the molecular geometry or the molecular shape of the molecule is simply described by the shape that the atoms make. And that shape is not a trigonal planar. That shape is called bent or angular. When a lone pair is involved, it is somewhat invisible in terms of looking at the molecular shape of the molecule. The molecular shape only describes the shape of the atoms as they're bonded to each other. And so when there are 3 groups around the center, the electron geometry is trigonal planar. No ifs, no ands, no buts. This table is exactly the answer for all electron geometries. But if a lone pair is involved in a trigonal planar electron geometry, the molecular geometry is described as bent or angular because that's all I see when I look at the molecule, when I look at the position of the atoms. This lone pair is taking up space. In fact, it's actually taking up a little more space than the groups that are bonded to atoms, and that makes this angle between the 2 atoms attached to the center actually a little less than 120. You can still describe it as 120 degrees for purposes of this class, but it's actually a little smaller than that because this lone pair, which takes up so much space, is pushing down on it. If all 3 groups have atoms attached, they're all going to take up the space somewhat equally, but if there's a lone pair and 2 atoms attached, then that's going to push a little. But again, the molecular geometry is bent or angular. Now if I have 3 groups around a central atom, those 3 groups will take on a trigonal planar arrangement. No ifs, no ands, no buts. The electron geometry with 3 groups is a trigonal planar. If only 1 atom is attached and the other 2 groups are lone pairs, those lone pairs still take up space in the trigonal planar arrangement, but I would describe the geometry of this molecule, the molecular geometry, as the shape describing the 2 atoms that are attached to each other, in which case I would describe it as a linear molecule. Let's move on to 4 groups because I have so much fun drawing these. I encourage you to look at lots of pictures of these. 4 groups around a central atom is a tetrahedral. No ifs, no ands, no buts. These are the way we would describe the electron geometry about a central atom with that many groups attached. So 4 groups around a central atom takes on a tetrahedral electron geometry. If there is an atom attached in all 4 positions, I still call the molecular geometry tetrahedral because it's taking the shape of a tetrahedral. If there are only 3 atoms attached and a group of lone pair, one group is a lone pair, the lone pair is taking up space, and I could have put it in any of the 4 positions. I chose to put it up. That lone pair takes up space. It occupies one of the positions of the tetrahedron, but I describe the shape of the molecule, the molecular geometry, by the shape made by the central atom and the 3 groups attached, and I call that a trigonal pyramid. I encourage you to look at lots of pictures and models of this. What we have is we have a central atom with the 3 legs pointing down at the tabletop, and it sits up off the tabletop. This is raised a little bit off the tabletop, and so it's a pyramid that has a 3-sided base. This is a trigonal pyramid. It is hard to tell from my picture, granted. I encourage you to look at lots of models of these. All right, so 4 groups around the central atom. Electron geometry is tetrahedral. If only 3 atoms are attached and one of the groups is a lone pair, I call that a trigonal pyramid. Let's look at the tetrahedral again. And let's say, again, 4 groups around the center, tetrahedral, no ifs, no ands, no buts. But let's say only 2 atoms are attached. The other 2 groups of the 4 are lone pairs. And it doesn't matter where I put the lone pairs. I'm trying to put it where it's easiest to see, but I encourage you to go look at pictures of these things. Here I have my central atom, my 4 groups in the shape of a tetrahedral, but only this group and this group have atoms attached. The other 2 groups are lone pairs. And so I want to describe this molecule. The molecular shape in this case is bent or angular. Now a minute ago we said that we had a bent or angular in this instance. It is different than the bent or angular in this instance because the bent or angular up above had an electron geometry of a trigonal planar, which means that the angle here is about 120. We said it was a little smaller than that. This bent or angular down below has an electron geometry of a tetrahedron, so the angle here is about 109, 109.5. Again, it actually is a little smaller than that because of the lone pair, but it's the angle that we see on a tetrahedron. I forgot to put it over here, but this angle would be at about 109, 109.5. It's the angle we see for a tetrahedron. We could take this one step further. With a central atom and 3 lone pairs, meaning only 1 atom was attached to my electron geometry of a tetrahedron, I'd be down to simply a linear. So here we have examples of starting with a linear electron geometry. We have linear molecular geometries. That's really our only option, and we saw that up here at the top. With a trigonal planar electron geometry, we can have a trigonal planar molecular geometry if all 3 groups have atoms attached. We could have a bent or angular molecular geometry if we end up with a lone pair, or we could have a linear geometry if there are 2 lone pairs and 1 atom attached. With a tetrahedral electron geometry, we might have a tetrahedral molecular geometry if there are 4 atoms attached. We could end up with a trigonal pyramid molecular geometry if there is a lone pair, or we could end up with bent or angular if there are 2 lone pairs. I encourage you not to simply write these down and look back at your list every time, but draw them or make these models and see them. If you don't have a model kit at home, toothpicks and marshmallows work great for making these models. All right, let's clear some space and we'll work on the last 2 electron geometries.